let's go over the prompts for the free energy short essays. So based on the worksheet scenarios that you answered earlier, now we're going to take that a step further and try to write some free responses. So let's examine the first prompt. Recall that free energy is the energy available for use in an ecosystem. Explain how changes in free energy availability can result in disruptions to an ecosystem. Okay, so you're going to talk about disruptions to an ecosystem. Given the following 3 examples of possible disruptions, discuss their effects on energy availability. What that means is you're going to discuss the amount of energy that's going to be available in an ecosystem after one of these disruptions. So, drought in a grassland ecosystem, right? So, what is that going to do to the available energy to the ecosystem? What about an upwelling of nutrient rich coast waters by a hurricane? Now, those nutrients feed phytoplankton. What is that going to do to the available energy in that ecosystem? What about the killing of gray wolves by humans in a forest? What is that going to do to energy availability? So not the effect on the organisms above or below in food chains. We'll get to that in a second. It's the amount of energy that's available. Okay. Prompt number 2. Given the same 3 examples of possible disruptions, discuss their effects on the number and size of trophic levels. Trophic levels are just the feeding levels within food webs and food chains and energy pyramids. So how will other organisms be in the ecosystem be affected? So if there is a drought in the grassland ecosystem, what is that going to do to the rest of the food chain? If there is an upwelling of nutrient-rich coast waters by a hurricane, what will that do to the rest of the food chain? Based on the phytoplankton. What happens to the killing of gray wolves by humans? How is that going to affect the rest of the organisms in the food chain or food web? So that's what we're talking about for number 2. Number 3, explain how changes in the number of producers by disease and outbreaks can affect the number and size of other trophic levels. So if producers are struck down by a disease outbreak, what's that going to do to the rest of the trophic levels? Now, for the last one, you have a food web that represents the grasslands of Yellowstone National Park. You're going to use that to answer these 2 questions here. So, briefly describe what would happen in each of the following if the following groups were removed for the park. So each situation is different. You're going to need to address all 3 of these. So what's going to happen if we remove coyotes from the park? Separate. What happens if we remove all primary producers from the park? Separate. What if we remove all consumers from the park? Okay. How is that going to affect each of the groups? Then you're going to discuss 2 possible consequences of adding a new primary consumer to the park, one that feeds strictly on grasses. What is that going to do? What are 2 possible consequences of adding this new primary consumer? So there are your explanations. Good luck writing, and I will see you soon.